Well, welcome, hello, and hi to everybody out there. I am Miss Mary, and I'm coming to you live from the Chisholm Trail Heritage Center here in Duncan, Oklahoma in our Chuck Wagon Theater. So today for our Trail Talk series, we have a special guest that is going to come and give us a little history of her life. And so right now, I would like to welcome you all, Miss Lizzie Johnson, the Cattle Queen of Texas.
Well, thank you very much, Miss Mary.
You're welcome.
Hello.
I'm going to let her talk to you guys, and you guys enjoy.
Well, thank you. Well, my name is Elizabeth Ellen Johnson Williams, but I am best known as Lizzie Johnson, the Cattle Queen of Texas. I'm not originally from Texas. My family moved there from Missouri when I was a young girl. My parents were both educators, teachers, and they just felt as though Texas needed their skills. So they took our family there, and in 1852 they opened the Johnson Institute. That was a coeducational boarding school. Boys and girls both lived there on the campus, and of course I was able to go to school there as well. Now, my parents hired other teachers to work there at the Institute because of the number of children that attended, but my mother taught music, and then she also helped the children with activities, things like, well, she prepared the meals for everyone, and she helped them with their laundry, you know, all that sort of thing. My father was qualified to teach every other subject that was taught, and he did so as needed, including the Bible. You see, our family always held fast to two ideals: faith in God and education. Well, while I was going to school there, I learned that I had a love for math, numbers. I just loved it. I hope some of you feel the same way. But when I found a way to use numbers in business in a study called bookkeeping, I knew that that was the thing I wanted to do. But really, being a teacher was kind of expected of me. So I went to school there at the Institute, graduated, I went off to university, and when I graduated from there, I came back and I taught at the Institute. After a few years of teaching there, however, I moved into Austin, and I taught there, and eventually I opened my own educational academy. I was actually a teacher for more than 20 years, but because I loved bookkeeping so much, every opportunity I had, I would work as a bookkeeper on the side. And it turns out that I had that opportunity very often. You see, in those days, the cattle companies had begun popping up all over South Texas. There was a reason for that. It was right after the Civil War. During the Civil War, Texas had fought for the Confederacy. Once the war was over, the Confederate money that everyone had in Texas was worthless. Texas needed United States dollars to boost their economy. Well, as the ranchers returned home from fighting in the war, they found that their cattle herds had grown out of control. In addition to that, there were wild cattle roaming the plains of Texas, and well, we all know those as the Longhorns. Well, Texas pretty much had more cattle than they knew what to do with. But people in the north and east parts of the United States, they needed beef. They desired it, but they didn't have any because, well, frankly, their cattle herds had been wiped out feeding troops and just trying to keep everyone alive during the war. So some very smart businessmen put their heads together. Some of them were able to convince the railroads to lay their tracks as far west as Abilene, Kansas. Other people put together these cattle companies and hired cowhands, and they began driving cattle north, up from Texas, across Oklahoma, and into Abilene, Kansas. Now, Oklahoma wasn't a state in those days just yet, but they crossed those lands that belonged to Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory. Well, during this same time period, there was a man named Jesse Chisholm, and he owned a trading post in Council Grove, Indian Territory. While he was out delivering goods and things to customers, his wagon wheels left some ruts in the ground. As those cowboys came north with their cattle, they came up on those ruts and decided to follow them for a ways to see where they led. That soon became the favorite trail of all the cattle companies. You see, that had fewer river crossings and more than enough grass for all those cattle to eat. There were other cattle trails that were taken, but the Chisholm Trail is probably the best known of all. Well, with all those cattle basically free for the taking in Texas and selling for $30, $40, $50 a head up in the northeast part of the United States, you can imagine how much money was exchanging hands. And so my bookkeeping skills were really in high demand. So I worked for some of those companies, and it didn't really take me long to realize I didn't want to work for someone else's cattle company. I wanted to own one myself. But as a teacher and a bookkeeper, I wasn't making enough money to do that. So I took on a third job. I began writing short stories and selling them to a publication called Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly. Now, when I wrote and sold those stories, I used something called a nom de plume. A pseudonym or pen name maybe is a term you're more familiar with. In other words, I never signed Lizzie Johnson to any of those stories. I sold them under a different name, and I never told anyone what that name is. I'm not going to tell you today either. Sorry. Well, because I was so good at saving money, it didn't take me long to have enough to go on to the next step in starting my own company. I went to the county courthouse to register my brand. Now, a brand was something people used to mark their cattle. These cattle were roaming everywhere, even in the cattle drives. Sometimes one herd might cross up with another, and you had to have your cattle clearly marked so that you came out with your own cattle. So in order to do that, folks would have their cowhands build a fire out on the plains, and they'd round those cattle up, and then they'd catch them one at a time. And they'd take a branding iron, much like this one that I'm holding, and put it down in the fire, the part that has the important information on it. They'd put that in the fire, and they'd leave it there until that metal turned red hot. And then they'd hold those poor cattle down, and they'd put that iron on them and hold it there until it burned a permanent scar in the side of the cattle. Well, some of you folks might be thinking that's a little rough on those poor cattle, but honestly, it was just the best thing to do, and from what I understand, they still use this practice today, so I guess it maybe isn't all that bad. Well, I signed up my brand, and once it was registered at the courthouse, that meant that no one else in the county where I lived could use my brand. Then I took 3,000 gold dollars. I went and bought some land just outside of Austin, a small herd of cattle, and I hired some cowhands to work for me. My herd just wasn't big enough to be competitive in that market though, so I had those hands go out and, well, you remember those wild longhorns I mentioned earlier? I just had them catch some of those that didn't have a brand on them. And they put my brand and brought them into my herd. Now that practice was called brush popping. It was common in those days. Some people frowned on that, but as a businesswoman, I found that to be one of the best ways for me to grow my herd without spending very much money. It made good business sense. Speaking of business sense, you know, it was almost unheard of for a woman to be involved in business at most any level as a leader or someone in charge of a business. And so for me to be a successful cattlewoman, well, that was something that was quite an oddity, but I've always felt blessed by so many things that were working in my favor. For instance, I had a very good education. My parents encouraged me to work hard and to go after my dreams, and so I did. I wasn't afraid to work hard. I had 3 jobs at one time if I thought I needed to. And I had a good way of communicating with the men who were in the cattle business, and so I earned their respect. All those things were working in my favor, but there was one other thing that was so helpful. In those days, there were people who were felt like it was important for women to have more opportunities in the business world. And so that timing all came together, and I was the one who benefited from it. I'll never forget that. Well, in 1878, I was still unmarried. Not because I had not been pursued, courted, even proposed to any number of times. I just never thought I'd met the right fella. But that was the year I met Hezekiah Williams. Hess, as I called him, was a retired preacher. He was a widower. His wife had died, and he had 4 grown children. Now, Hess was in the cattle business at this time in his life, and so was I. That's how our paths crossed. Hess wasn't quite as good at making money in the cattle business as I was, but it gave us a good reason to get together. And, well, he was just so handsome, I couldn't help myself. He proposed, and I said yes, and we planned to get married. Before we decided to marry, though, or I guess actually went through the ceremony, I proposed something to Hess myself. I just asked him if he would mind signing a little agreement. All it said was anything that I owned before we were married, and any money I made or things I acquired while we were married would be mine, and he could keep things that were his. Oh, Hess was more than agreeable to sign that, and so he did, and we were married. As a married couple, though, we actually did keep our cattle herds separate. We shared some of the same cow hands, though, so sometimes when Hess's cows were having calves, I'd have those cow hands go over and put my brand on his calves before he could brand them. Turns out he was doing the same thing to me. Don't you know those cow hands had a big laugh over all of that? I'm sure they did. Well, Hess and I were fortunate enough to send cattle up the Chisholm Trail a number of times. We really had a lot of success in the cattle business. As a matter of fact, I was the first woman to accompany her own herd of cattle up the trail. Now, I didn't ride horseback like all those cowboys did. I rode in my buggy alongside, but oh, what a grand adventure that was. Well, after a number of years of cattle drives and good business, all of that began to slow down, eventually coming to a stop. There were several reasons for that. One was barbed wire fences. I mean, farmers were planting crops and they didn't like the cattle trampling their crops. As a businesswoman, I understand that. That was their way of making money. But those barbed wire fences required us to find routes that went around that land, and that extended the time it took us to get our cattle to the market, and, well, that cost us money. There were also some diseases going through different herds of cattle, and so ranchers who once just let us take our cattle right across their land made us stop and quarantine our cattle, sometimes for as long as 2 weeks, to make sure there were none in our herds that were sick who might then infect their herds. That, again, really cost us money by not allowing us to get up there to Abilene as quick as we needed to. And then more and more railroads were built, and places where you could load cattle, and you didn't have to take them 1,000 miles to get them to Abilene anymore. And so the days of the long cattle drives just eventually came to an end. Frankly, Hess and I didn't want it to come to an end. And so we found out about a thriving cattle market in Cuba. That's right, I said Cuba, that island country off the coast of Florida. We shipped our cattle down there and moved to Cuba. And we were having a grand time when one day, all of a sudden, Hess was gone. He had been kidnapped by bandits. I was terribly disturbed, and And when they sent the note that said they wanted $50,000 for his safe return, well, I had no choice. I gave them the money. They gave Hess back, and once he was home and I could see he was okay, well, we sat down and had a little talk. I mentioned to you earlier about Hess's business sense maybe not being, I don't know, so good. It's certainly not up to mine. Anyway, I just felt as though I had bailed him out of bad business decisions so many times in the past that getting himself kidnapped was the last straw. I told him he owed me $50,000. Well, Hess didn't really have that, and so we made an agreement. He just signed over everything that he owned. I gave him $20,000 cash, and we called it even. Now, I know this sounds like an unusual way for a marriage to work, but it really did work for us. You know, Hess just loved his cattle and everything so much, though. I never really took advantage of that situation. He still got to do all the things with those cattle that he loved so much. Now, Hess and I accrued a lot of money, mainly because, as I would say, we were very wise about what we spent money on. Some people, though, called us penny pinchers, and that always offended me. We weren't penny pinchers. We spent money when we wanted to, and we would often travel. And when we did, I would always look for the latest fashion trends and the most beautiful fabrics, because I thought if I was going to be known as the cattle queen, that I should surely look like one. Now, wouldn't you all agree with that? Well, on one such trip, Hess and I were actually in El Paso. It was 1914. And, well, Hess suddenly became very sick and he died. Oh, I was heartbroken. I went and purchased a casket to have his body sent back to Austin, and, well, when I signed the bill of sale, I just wrote, "I loved this old buzzard this much." I really did love him a lot, and I guess you couldn't really put a dollar amount on it, but that kind of gives you an idea of how I felt about Hess. So, not long after that, I sold the cattle and the ranch, and I moved into the city of Austin. You know, things weren't just very fun without Hess around. And so today, I just spend my days quietly in Austin. You know, I'll never forget the successes I had, the great adventures Hess and I had together, and, well, it's been a wonderful life. I hope I haven't taken up too much of your time. Miss Mary, I think that's all I've got to tell today.
Well, thank you, Miss Johnson.
Oh, of course.
What a life.
Well, yes, it was a grand life.
It
for
sounds
sure.
like you had many adventures.
Yes.
If you have a few minutes, we do like to ask you maybe a couple of questions.
Oh, of course.
Okay. Well, my first question is, you and Hess had quite a life.
Mm-hmm.
Did it seem awkward, or who kept the books, if you would, in your
Oh,
home?
well-
Did that seem awkward for him?
Well, even though we kept our herds separate, Hess never minded me helping him with his bookkeeping. I mean, it was my specialty after all. And so I always kind of just made sure everything was, you know, we were always in the black and had money saved up. And, well, even when we traveled, it wasn't uncommon for Hess to be the one to go out and meet people for dinner or go to different engagements and shows, and I would just kind of stay back and, you know, go over the books. I guess you could say once a bookkeeper, always a bookkeeper.
Just in your blood, right?
Right.
Well, that is funny.
Yeah.
Now, when he was kidnapped, were you threatened? Were you scared at any point? Because that had to have been a scary situation.
I was concerned, but, you know, money talks. And I felt very strongly that giving the money in exchange for Hess was a fair way to do things. And, well, you know, we got him back, so I guess it all worked out in the end.
It was worth it in the end.
It was worth it in the end.
Right.
Yes, it was.
Very good. All right. Well, Miss Johnson, you had an incredible life.
I did.
Had a incredible story. I think everyone that's tuned in today probably would agree with me that we appreciate you coming by. We appreciate you being here. One last question.
Oh, yes.
Your brand.
Oh, my brand was the CY brand.
Now, does that mean anything? Is there any significance to that?
Well, Miss Mary, let me put it this way. There are some things that a woman should never tell. Her age, her weight, her bank balance, and the origin of her brand.
I would
just
have
keep
to
it at that.
agree. I agree with those very well. Thank you very much.
Of course, of course.
All right. Well, boys, girls, ladies and gentlemen, I think that kind of concludes the end of our trail talk.
Oh, okay. All
So,
right.
Miss Johnson, if you have anything else you'd like to say?
No, I just thank you all so much for listening today. It's such a joy to share my story with others.
I appreciate you coming by and spending your time with us.
Yes, I'm glad to.
I want to let you guys know that tomorrow here at 3 o'clock, we are going to be live once again with our Trail Talk series. We will have Mr. Jim Weaver joining us, and we will be displaying his leather exhibit, which will be really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You can find more information on our website, on thechisholmtrail.com. You're more than welcome to call up here if you have any questions, 252-6692, or look for anything on our social media outlets as well. Anybody have any questions, any comments? If you do, just wave your hands, ask away. Otherwise, I believe we are going to unmute everybody and we will sign off with happy trails all together with the group.
Well, that sounds fun.
You want to join us?
Oh, I'd love to.
All right. So, 1, 2, 3. Happy